Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
The end of World War II, peace and prosperity. Whoever lived in a simpler age, whoever thought they were living in a simpler age?
Like people that long for the 1950s, you know, well, that was, you hear that all the time now, nostalgia for that. Well, that's when there was segregation in the South, Jim Crow, African Americans with no rights.
Underwear
And getting cut from the junior varsity team, that's all I think about, you know. I mean, beneath the surface, the Cold War.
Look at the Cold War culture. Averell Harriman used to say after World War II, we want to come back to drink Coca-Cola and have normalcy of some sort. Did we achieve that? Well, yes and no.
Today, the 50s, on a biography of America. After the German surrender, a jubilant Winston Churchill declared that the war in Europe was won by American mass production. Without disagreeing, the journalist Ernie Pyle put a different meaning on this. Pyle wrote that he hoped people would celebrate the victory with a sense of relief, not elation. For in high spirits, it was easy to forget the dead GIs. Dead, he wrote, by mass production. Dead in such monstrous infinity that you come to hate them. To you at home, they are columns of figures. Or he is a near one who went away and just didn't come back. You don't see him, lying so grotesque and pasty beside the gravel road in France. We saw him by the multiple thousands. That's the difference. Pyle's editors refused to publish this dispatch. It was too dark a verdict on total war by mass production. Pyle wrote this at sea near Japan, where he'd been sent for the final act of the war. On April 12th, he learned via wireless that President Roosevelt had died of a stroke. Young soldiers and sailors told him that Roosevelt was the only president they'd ever known. To many of them, he was America. 6 days later, Roosevelt's successor, little-known Harry S. Truman of Independence, Missouri, announced, "The nation is saddened again by the death of Ernie Pyle." Pyle was killed by enemy fire the day he landed in a campaign to take Okinawa, which was to be a staging area for the invasion of Japan. American forces had reached Okinawa only 350 miles from Japan by a two-pronged offensive. General Douglas MacArthur's combined Army and Air Wing advanced northward from the Solomon Islands, just north of Australia, toward the Philippines, which MacArthur had sworn earlier to liberate, while the Navy and Marines, under Admiral Chester Nimitz, pressed westward through the Central Pacific, capturing in brutal fighting one tiny Japanese-occupied island after another, till they finally took the Mariana Islands. There in the Marianas, airfields were built for gigantic new weapons called B-29s, super fortresses that would bring down fire and ruin on the wooden cities of Japan. After MacArthur captured the Philippines, the invasion of Okinawa began on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1944. It was the greatest combined land, air, and sea operation in history, and the bloodiest island fight of the Pacific War. Over 200,000 people died, and there were more American casualties in D-Day, almost 50,000. Japanese kamikaze, or suicide planes, each carrying one 500-pound bomb with only enough fuel for a one-way flight, crash-bombed into the naval support fleet, killing almost 5,000 seamen and sinking 30 ships. While on the ground, U.S. troops used flamethrowers, each carrying 300 gallons of napalm against Japanese hidden in caves and underground shelters. The Japanese fought according to the ancient code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. It was total resistance, defiance to the last man, no surrender, no prisoners. Japanese soldiers wrapped packs of explosives around their bodies and flung themselves against tanks. As Private E.B. Sledge wrote, the only way you could get it over with was to kill them before they killed you. It was kill or be killed. You killed in order to keep on living. This merciless fighting was fed by inflamed racism. To the Japanese, who prided themselves on being genetically pure, uncontaminated by immigration, Americans were mongrelized brutes, devils and demons, while Japanese atrocities against American war prisoners and their suicidal banzai charges were seen by the Americans as signs of their barbarity. Atrocity followed atrocity. In a break in the fighting, Sled saw a Japanese soldier squatting on the ground in front of a machine gun. He was dead. The top of his head had been blown off. I noticed this buddy of mine, Sled writes, just flipping chunks of coral into his skull. There was nothing malicious in his actions. This was just a mild-mannered kid who was now a 20th century savage. How could American boys do this, Sledge asked, and then answered, if you're reduced to savagery, anything's possible. We were savages. We had all become hardened. We were out there, human beings, the most highly developed form of life on Earth, fighting each other like wild animals. The guys in the B-29s over Japan were hardened too, only they were killing by remote control, by pushing buttons. Here's John Chardy, the great American poet and humanist, who happened to be a gunner on a B-29 in the war. We were in the terrible business of burning out Japanese towns. That meant women and old people and children. One part of me, a surviving savage voice, says, I'm sorry we left any of them living. But then Ciardi adds, your rationality tells you, come on, this is a human race. Let's try to be civilized. Under Air Force General Curtis LeMay, gruff, cigar-chopping, tough as nails, the 21st Bomber Command went on a mission of annihilation. LeMay was a 20th century William Tecumseh Sherman. You've got to kill people, he said, and when you've killed enough, they stop fighting. And that's just about how it happened. To avoid an invasion of Japan, LeMay wiped out Japan, or at least most of its urban culture. His specialty was low-altitude firebombing of densely packed workers' housing. He used 100-pound oil gel bombs, bombs in which the burning, gelatinized gasoline sticks on people and is almost impossible to put out. LeMay's incendiaries didn't just set fires, they produced thermal hurricanes, storms that sucked the air out of people's lungs. In just one raid, an estimated 100,000 people died in Tokyo, and 1 million in that same raid were injured. LeMay's air boys inflicted damage on that scale on 65 other Japanese cities, killing nearly 1 million people. The only reason he didn't bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima was that his superiors wanted virgin targets to test the power of the atomic bomb. Those tests came in August 1945, and they were terrifyingly successful. People who were alive one second were vaporized the next. People walked around in shock with skin hanging from their body. And at one infirmary, when they ran out of medication, volunteers sterilized the wounds with salt water. People were so damaged, one volunteer recalls, that we had to take brooms, dip them into salt water, and paint the bodies. While the Japanese were fanatical earlier in the war in their sacrifice of lives, America's countervailing fanaticism might have been technological. As historian Stephen Ambrose writes, in Japan, the bomber, long considered the ultimate in strategic might, had reached its moment of total and awful triumph. Philip Morrison, a scientist who helped invent the atomic bomb, later argued that the atom bomb was, in his words, not a discontinuity. We were just carrying on more of the same, he says, only it was cheaper. One bomb, one city. Morrison insists that it's the cheapness of nuclear bombs that makes them so dangerous. The legacy of World War II is a world cleansed of German and Japanese despotism. But the legacy of that despotism is the bomb. Good men like Morrison willingly hardened themselves and risked everything on the defeat of evil. F. Scott Fitzgerald claimed that the test of a first-rate intelligence is to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. By that definition, my father, who served in the war, was a genius. Think of the survivors of Dachau cheering the American troops, he would say, and then think of Nagasaki. The war was insane, in his words, but we had to fight it. No regrets. So the greatest war in the history of the world ended with the surrender of a government that boasted it would eat stones before it would give up. This isn't the place to debate Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb. He did it, he says, to save American lives in an invasion of Japan. And that's how most Americans saw it then, especially after they read about the fanatical Japanese resistance on Okinawa. Had Americans not dropped the bomb, Japan might have surrendered before an invasion. But all the sound scholarship on this question can't assure us that it would have happened. And what if Truman had not used the bomb, and there had been an invasion with lots of casualties, and People found out at this point that he had this big weapon all along. Truman could never have withstood that kind of protest. But I have to ask, why Nagasaki? Why that second bomb? And so soon after the first one? Philip Morrison, who was in the circle, says that from the beginning, 2 bombs were ordered so the Japanese would not think that we had only 1 bomb and made them one at a time. Somehow, that doesn't satisfy me. But Americans back then saw it differently. In my old neighborhood, my mother tells me that people celebrated, honked their horns, hugged each other when they heard of the word of the Japanese surrender. That's what the bomb meant to them. Peace at last. The killing was over. Husbands and sons would come home. It's hard to imagine how much power and prestige America had in 1945. And here at the end of the war, you have this power that sacrificed so many of its young lives, sitting on top of the world, the only superpower in the world at that point. We had the bomb, the super bomb, that made us the only superpower until the Soviet Union later developed one. And we had this incredible economic abundance. We hadn't been hit by the war. Our cities hadn't been pillaged. Our cities hadn't been bombed. We had this tremendous surge of economic prosperity that began in 1941, 42, and the GI Bill fed right into the mood of economic prosperity. It was a bonanza, a social bonanza, one of the most important pieces of social legislation of the mid-20th century. It gave GIs the opportunity to do 2 things. It gave them money for education. It also provided money for down payments on homes, and they all wanted to marry, have children, and get into a decent American home. The problem was, there was a terrible shortage of housing for returning veterans.
The U.S. Census estimates that 3 million families in America are living doubled up, a condition creating severe social difficulties and even acute breakdowns in family life.
We believe that every family in the United States is entitled to decent shelter. We believe that private enterprise should provide that shelter insofar as it can.
Bill Levitt was an amazing character. He's kind of the Henry Ford of the middle of the 20th century, where Ford mass-produced Model T cars, Levitt mass-produced homes. And as a veteran during World War II, a Seabee building air bases out in the Pacific, Levitt came up with his dream of building an idyllic community for lower middle class, striving, upward-bound American GIs, who he knew would come out of the war with some opportunity, with the GI Bill, and he was there to take advantage of it. So what Levitt does is he goes out to Long Island on a stretch of potato fields, and he builds his ideal community. By the time it was finished, he had a complete community, 80,000 people, about 17,000 to 18,000 houses. And the key thing with these houses is they were inexpensive and they were well built. They were sturdy like the old Model T Fords, and they even were produced like Model T Fords. They were mass-produced. Levitt broke down the whole process, as Adam Smith would do with the Division of Labor, and he broke down the building process into 27 components, and he trained a team to do each component.
These are the 36 men who built this house. Another day, another 40 houses.
He even had one team that did nothing but bolt washing machines, into the floor. He didn't build foundations, so that saved a lot of the cost. When the house was up, it cost around $8,000, and all you needed for a down payment was about $90. And Levitt threw in a free television set and washing machine. So this was perfect. And this is the real beginning of true suburbanization. It all emerges almost eureka-like suddenly in the early 1950s. There's just this explosion of suburban growth. There were a legion of books being produced in the 1950s that attacked the homogenization and blandness of suburbia, bland people living in bland houses led by bland presidents like Eisenhower. But to Americans at that time who lived in places like Levittown, this was a great step upward. It was a realization of the American dream, that if you worked hard, you could make it, and you could provide security for your family through a home. There was the expectation of that. In 1952, Eisenhower is elected president, and in a sense, becomes the perfect American president for the 1950s.
So help you God. So help me God.
Here was the great war hero, the general who commanded the troops at D-Day, the supreme Allied commander. And for a lot of Americans, he's the perfect president, because this is an age when people don't want to tamper with too much, when reform goes off the agenda. And Eisenhower is doing other things that people want and feel they need. He's building things, the St. Lawrence Seaway. He's building a federal highway program.
The highway construction program initiated by Ike is the biggest peacetime enterprise ever undertaken. It will cost 10. Ike's defense policy affords the country the maximum protection.
And he's also building a deterrence to the Soviet Union. This was the beginning of the Cold War, an ideological war against a common enemy, international communism.
The continuance of our present leadership.
All Americans are united in the fact that the outside menace is communism, godless communism.
And see how it spread. Some areas were gobbled up. Some became Russian-dominated satellites in Europe and in Asia.
And you have to understand, communism is not just a military threat. This is a system that is antithetical to everything Americans hold dear. All right, we come out of the war, we're a tremendously prosperous nation. What's the root of that prosperity? Capitalism. Communism threatens that. We're a God-fearing country. What does communism stand for? Godlessness, okay? So all the things that America was, an upwardly advancing, mobile, competitive, God-fearing, capitalist society, Russia isn't. And I think it's that feeling that we're being faced by that common threat that brings Americans together and creates this orthodoxy, homogeneity, tribalism, whatever you want to call it. And it's a glue that holds the culture together pretty strongly, and it can be, in a sense, pretty stifling, you know, for a lot of people, especially young people. We never really had teenagers before. Teenagers were just young people. And it isn't until the mid-1930s that over half of Americans are going to high school. They start to go to high school in great numbers during the Great Depression, because it's during the Great Depression that there are no jobs. Then, when they start to graduate from high school, the war comes along, and the first conscription law, the first draft law, provides that kids under the age of 19, they eventually lowered it to 18, couldn't serve in the armed forces. You can't serve in the armed forces, you're in high school, you don't have a job, you're a special class of people, teenagers. And teenage culture, I think, comes into real force in the 1950s. To the parents of young Americans, Levittown and places like that represented the American ideal. But a lot of young people found the culture conformist and stifling and started to break away from it a little bit. And a piece of technology allows this generational rift to get wider. And that little piece of technology isn't the television, because daddy controls the television. That's in the living room, okay? Like the old radio had been. Now you've got a transistor radio that you can buy in a store, and the transistor just comes online in the 1950s. And all of a sudden, you can turn that dial any way you want. The time was right for Elvis.
Last week, saw for the first time on television a young gentleman that we think is going to go a lot of places in the entertainment field. We brought him back again, and here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Elvis Presley.
The Elvis story is an interesting story. I mean, he changed the way we talked, he changed the way we walked, he changed the way we spoke, he changed the beat of the country, and he made the music of the underclass the music of the world. In a sense, that makes him a revolutionary. And he truly was in that respect, although a very innocent and almost unknowing revolutionary. Certainly he didn't set out to be one. He's a poor kid from Tupelo, Mississippi, whose father had worked in a munitions factory during World War II, and they were just poor roustabouts looking for work, the whole family. And they headed for Memphis. And you got to understand, Memphis is an interesting place. It's a convergence point, really, for two immigration movements. The immigration of whites of Scotch-Irish and Irish descent through the Appalachian Mountains and out into Mississippi. We often call their music hillbilly music, okay? Rockabilly, they often called it. At the same time, and lots of these people were living in Memphis. And just below Memphis, all the way down from Memphis to Vicksburg, is a place called the Delta, the great cotton planting region of the South at the time of the Civil War, and Memphis is a cotton exporting center. And there's a lot of poverty in the Delta, but there's rich music coming out of the Delta. You know, Howlin' Wolf and all the early greats like B.B. King, are, you know, blues singers are coming out of there. And they're migrating to a place called Beale Street, which is almost an all-black entertainment section in Memphis. And Elvis is fascinated by Beale Street, and he and his friends started to go down there, along with a couple other white rebel kids. And then more and more of these kids started to go there. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the black clubs wouldn't let white kids in. Then they started to let them in, but they roped them off into a separate section. Then all of a sudden, the music gets going, the rope goes down, and everybody's out there dancing. And that's taboo. This is the solid South. The segregation is South, and Memphis is a bastion of segregation. So this is a strange city for a revolution like this to take place. And a revolution it was, because people like Elvis were not only playing black music, but when Elvis hit it, and he hit it because he got hooked up with a guy named Sam Phillips. And Sam Phillips was an interesting kind of entrepreneur. He wasn't a social revolutionary. He was out to make a little money. He was a record producer with Sun Records. And he used to say to himself, what I need, if I really want to make a lot of money in this section of the country, is I need a white kid that can sing like a black guy. And Elvis happened to stumble into a studio one day and cut a record. And Elvis simply took off after that. And people are listening to his music, but get this, there are white kids listening to his music, and the white kids are picking up also on the black music.
Mama, that's all right for you. That's all right, no mama.
But what's happening is in the South as well in the 1950s is there's a groundswell that's starting to take place. Individuals start to emerge, insurgents, North as well as South. Thurgood Marshall, who takes this big case before the Supreme Court in 1954, wins the Brown versus Board education case and opens up schools to integration. And that starts to change everything in the South. There's a theory in history that often very, very small events can trigger huge changes. Rosa Parks gets on a bus in Montgomery. Buses were like plantations in Montgomery, Alabama. In most of the South, the bus was divided into a white section and a black section. But it was flexible in Montgomery, and it was all up to the plantation master, the bus driver. So the bus driver ruled. Rosa Parks sits on the bus one day, and she's sitting in a black section. A white guy gets on. He doesn't want to sit next to a black person. Bus driver turns around, says to Rosa Parks, who's tired after a hard day as a seamstress, you've got to move. Move another seat, move up a little bit further. She said, I'm in the black section. She refuses to move, she's arrested, she starts a civil rights revolution in a sense. The court intervened at the end of the Montgomery bus boycott and declared that the Montgomery law segregating buses was unconstitutional. So there's hope there that the federal government's on their side. And that creates this surge of resistance. If you're looking for the roots of the 1960s and the rebellion of the 60s, you don't go to 1968 to the zenith and peak of the movement. You go back to 1956, 57, 58, when all this starts to germinate. I mean, there's a tremendous undercurrent of dissent and disagreement in the 50s. You see it in popular music. You see it in popular literature with books like Jack Kerouac's On the Road. You even see it in the academic community with books like John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society. You see it in the early works of C. Wright Mills, who's criticizing the whole direction and bent of American prosperity, which ignores, as he says, 30% of the Americans who happen to be poor. And Rachel Carson writes The Silent Spring, which becomes the foundation of the modern environmental movement. Lewis Mumford starts to write a series of books about the city in history and technology in history, talking about our overdependence on technology.
The automobile industry has a formula.
Ralph Nader starts to question this with exhaust from cars and the safety of cars. General Motors comes out with a Corvair.
This is the sizzling Corvair Monza Spider with a whopping big 150 horsepower turbo air engine.
The Corvair had a problem. It flipped all the time. Nader starts exposing this. They start investigating him. All of a sudden, you got a movement for safety belts and safety control and things like this. A Northern housewife by the name of Betty Friedan from Smith College returned to a Smith College reunion to do a couple of articles about what it's like in college now in 1957 as opposed to what it was like when she went to school. She was aghast at what she saw, that these girls, highly trained, expensively educated, were just going to be off into a kitchen the day after they graduated, and there were no careers open to them. And she writes The Feminine Mystique, and that became a powerful inciter of the women's movement of the 1960s. In the popular mind, the 50s were all about boring conformity, the man in the gray flannel suit, bland suburbanization, resistance to anything that threatened the established order. But below the surface, there was something else, the seeds of the 60s, a decade of social, cultural, and political upheaval.
For information about A Biography of America, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org. Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.